Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I am Lisa Johnson from the Dane County Extension Office. I'm the horticulture educator for Dane County, and I am very fortunate to have PJ Leash as our guest today, who's going to be talking about spongy moth. But before we start that, my partner in giving this presentation with PJ is the Tree Canopy Collaborative. So I am going to give just a little promo for the Tree Canopy Collaborative, because if you're interested in increasing tree canopy, we're looking to use GIS mapping to identify areas in the county that are lacking trees. And we are overlaying those maps with census data that shows communities that are highly diverse and that may be experiencing low income, areas that were frequently previously redlined, et cetera. So we're focusing on those kinds of communities where we can make the biggest impact. And the Tree Canopy Collaborative, as you can see, is an initiative of the Dane County Office of Energy and Climate Change. And one of the things that we are concentrating on is the lovely spongy moth that we're all here to hear about today. So we do have a lot of information there. And then if you are interested in what's happening to our tree canopy and has been happening, and more about the investigating tree canopy cover and race in Madison, and if you're interested in signing up to be a tree planting volunteer, we would absolutely love to have you. So please do consider that. And today's presentation, of course, is going to be concentrating on spongy moth management, but the other is important too. So I'm going to stop my share and let PJ start his share. And I will let PJ introduce himself.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lisa.
Oh,
Thanks.
I did forget one thing, of course. We are going to take questions at the end. Please do feel free to type them into the chat. Because we have so many people online, we can't really open up the microphones, but please do enter any questions that you have in the chat and we will look at those at the end. Thanks.
All right, folks. Thanks for joining me today. Thank you very much, Lisa, for coordinating this, as well as the Tree Canopy Collective for the opportunity today to talk about a very timely topic, which is spongy moth. Before I dive into things, a brief kind of housekeeping type note. If you notice this box on the right-hand portion of the slide, you can go to the website for the lab that I run, the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab. On my website, at that web address on the screen, you can go there, and under resources in the menu bar, there's an item for presentation notes. And so you can click on that and get a PDF handout of today's notes if you want those. So you can either head to that link, or if you do a Google search for UW Insect Diagnostic Lab, you'll be able to find my website. And again, the notes are on there. I'll put that same link up again on my final slide today if you don't have a chance to jot it down now. But my name is PJ Leash. I'm an extension entomologist here at UW-Madison. I run the insect diagnostic lab, so I help identify insects, but I also interact a lot with the public and answer questions about tree care, shrub care, and insects in a lot of other scenarios as well. So jumping into today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the brief history of spongy moth. We're going to talk about a little bit more recent history, what's been going on in the state the last couple of years here to kind of set the stage for what we're seeing here in Madison and other parts of the state. We're going to discuss biology of the spongy moth because it's really critical to understand that there are different ways to go about managing spongy moth, and there are certain life stages like the pupae in adults that we don't get a whole lot of bang for our buck if all we're doing is trying to manage those. The damaging life stages, the larvae or caterpillars, that's going to get our attention. But the bulk of this insect's life cycle is spent as the egg stage for about 9 months or so. And so we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different ways to manage the different life stages and things that you can do in your own yard. And then we're going to discuss different scenarios. And sometimes you have to look at all the tools in the toolbox and pick and choose what is most appropriate for your given situation. So just a little bit of the history of spongy moths. So this slide here, this newspaper article, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it dates back to the late 1970s. Some of our very first reports of spongy moth, it used to be called gypsy moth, but spongy moth in the state date back to about the mid-70s, 1975 in Appleton area, Lawrence University, Economowoc, 1977. So this is something that we've been talking about for 50 or so-ish years. Like a lot of insects, their populations can kind of ebb and flow. We happen to be at kind of a high point right now for their numbers. So it's really getting a lot of attention, hence today's topic. So first and foremost, what is the spongy moth? Probably needs very, very little introduction to this group. I do want to point out it used to be known as the gypsy moth. The official common name or recognized common name was changed about 2 years ago from gypsy moth to spongy moth. This is a non-native invasive insect. It is native to parts of Europe as well as parts of Asia as well. And it was introduced into New England, Massachusetts in the late 1860s, so just after the Civil War, so about 150-ish years ago. Since that time, from Massachusetts, it has spread westward and southward as well. And often we can see some pretty significant damage at kind of that leading edge. If you think of this as a wildfire, you get some sparks shooting out ahead, but where you get that leading edge of the fire tends to be pretty hot, so to speak. So that's often an analogy I like to use with this insect as well. And really the damaging life stage is photographed here in the bottom center photo. That's the caterpillar or larval stage. They use chewing mouthparts to feed on foliage of a wide range of plants. So that is the life stage that is actually causing damage and is going to catch your attention in a lot of the cases. Now, a little bit more about spongy moth in terms of the history of it. The very brief history is that it showed up. It was deliberately introduced, though, in the late 1860s. And this is pretty unique in terms of invasive species in that we can track it down to the exact individual, when, where, and the location of where it was introduced. This photo here, that home, that is this guy's house, Etienne Trivelot. He was actually an astronomer, an amateur scientist and entomologist too, in terms of his scientific accomplishments. He's probably better known on the astronomy side of things, but he had this idea of breeding a hardy silkworm. So he wanted to take our North American silkworm species, hybridize it with a hardy Northern European species, which was spongy moth or gypsy moth. His experiments didn't work. They didn't hybridize, and some accidentally escaped from his home, which you can see in that photo right there. So we know exactly where they were brought into the US. So from that time, 1869, I'll draw your attention to the maps on the left. You can see by 1900, there's some counties shaded in eastern Massachusetts. So about 30-ish years, not a whole lot of spread looking at the US as a whole. By 1915, some regional spread in New England, into Maine, New Hampshire, nearby states as well. Fast forward about 50 years, we see it pressing into eastern parts of New York. By the early 80s, so about 15, 16 years later, all of Pennsylvania has been found in, parts of Maryland, a jump there into the Midwest with the lower peninsula of Michigan. By 1990, for the most part, almost all of lower Michigan has had detections of this. And then right around late 90s and early 2000s, we start to see it appear here really in force. Again, some of our earliest detections date back to the mid 70s, late 70s, but about 2000 is when we really started having some heavier infestations of it. If I draw your attention to the map on the right, that is the status as of 2000, a very similar map to the one I just talked about. But in this map, areas that are considered infested are in red. There are areas that are kind of a transition zone. They're not heavily infested at that point in time, but there was some activity. That's that yellow band. So that's kind of that leading edge of the storm front, so to speak. And then gray areas are parts of the U.S. It hadn't really been causing issues in at that point. Now, when we jump to the next year, 2001, this is a different type of map. So this is a map from the Department of Ag here in the state from their Spongy Moth trapping survey. Now, the thing to know on this map is areas that are in pinkish or purple, we were finding more spongy moths in that part of the state. So for the most part, it's very far eastern Wisconsin, the counties that for the most part border Lake Michigan, maybe inland a row or two of counties. There's a peak in about Wapaka County as well. But for the most part, it's eastern Wisconsin. So that's 2001. Then when we jump ahead to the 2022 Spongy Moth Trapping Survey, we can see that has really shifted west a little bit, about 2/3 of the way through Wisconsin. So some areas shown in 2001 and 2002 as hotspots, areas like Walworth, Waukesha County, kind of Lake Geneva-ish area, lots of activity in that part of the state. But kind of the latest trend we've seen is Walworth County up through Rock, Dane County, through Devil's Lake State Park area, meandering up through Eau Claire, and then up by Bayfield and Ashland County. Lots of activity from spongy moth as well. Now, talking about a few more details from some recent trends here, just in about the last 3 to 4 years, we have been seeing populations of spongy moth trending upwards. We'll talk about why that is here in just a second. But one thing I'm going to keep coming back to is that weather can play potentially a really important role with this story. Dry spring weather can suppress some beneficial diseases. And if we have a wet spring, that can help us out. So one key factor, and I'll talk more about this in detail later on, there's an introduced fungal disease, a fungus, Entomophaga myrmiga, that can cause very high mortality of spongy moth caterpillars if we have damp, rainy conditions. So if it's dry, activity of that fungus is going to be lessened and suppressed. But if we have a rainy spring, that could really help us out. So if you want one thing that might kind of stop and reverse course of things, I would personally hope for a rainy spring coming up here. That will probably help out quite a bit. Now, there are some other factors related to weather that might affect populations a little bit. Things like heavy snow cover. If you have spongy moth egg masses that are down close to ground level and they are insulated with snow, they're kind of buffered from extreme cold. So that might impact things a little bit. Mild winter temperatures might increase survival of eggs potentially. I did just throw this in here recently because I figured someone would ask about this because we are having some pretty cold temperatures this week here in mid-January. And if you look at some of the numbers reported from U.S. Forest Service, if you want or you want to see egg mortality of spongy moth, you really want to have about 48 to 72 hours of about -20 Fahrenheit. So even though we've been cold recently, it hasn't quite gotten that cold of 2 to 3 days straight of -20. There's another study out of Michigan that looked at some mortality and basically counted the number of days at about -18 Fahrenheit, -26 Celsius. And in general, the more days you had at that temperature or lower, it decreased survival. And you can see the trend line in that chart there. So the colder it is and the longer that it's brutally cold, that's going to increase mortality of eggs. So yes, we've been pretty cold recently, but that's not cold enough to just like take out all the spongy moth eggs out there. Now, some other important trends I want to talk about in terms of recent activity in the state. So on the left here, the chart with the yellow bars on it, that's from Department of Ag here in the state. That's from some of the spongy moth trap counts. So if we look back about 5 or so years ago, 2018, 2019, you can see the numbers or average number of spongy moths per trap. In 2019, they were 4.8. So that was very low, relatively speaking, very few spongy moths caught in those traps. We see that trend upwards in 2020, 2021, big jump up in 2022. I couldn't find the 2023 survey data. It might not be published yet officially, but it's probably going to be high as well, would be my suspicion. So we can see those numbers trending upward. If you think about some of the weather patterns we've had in Wisconsin the last couple of years, we have had some dry, droughty conditions, or at least dry spells in spring and early summer. Even if you get a bunch of rain in August, September, if you had a dry spring when those caterpillars are active, that doesn't necessarily help us out as much. So timing of precipitation in a year could be a big factor. Now, another chart I want to draw your attention to, this is from colleagues with the Department of Natural Resources here in the state. This reddish chart is the acres defoliated by spongy moth for about the last 23 years or so. So if we look back about 5 to 10-ish years to about 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, very little acreage in terms of forested areas defoliated here in the state. The last time we had a big outbreak, you got to go back to about 2010, where we had almost 350,000 acres defoliated in the state. So for much of the last decade, things have been pretty good in terms of defoliation on a statewide basis when you look at forested areas. But we see a jump, a little jump up in 2021, 294, but still that's relatively low compared to other years. Jump up to 85,000 in 2022, and then a big jump reported last year of about 373,000 acres was the number that I found from a DNR report online. So that was our record here in terms of defoliation of forested areas in the state. And then one other thing to draw your attention to on this slide, the map in the upper right-hand corner was from Mike Hillstrom at the DNR. And those red spots on their map are areas of defoliation by spongy moth in forested parts of the state. Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't caterpillar activity in other areas. I know there was lots of activity here in Madison and other areas. I live in Middleton, plenty of activity there as well. But in terms of forested areas defoliated, we see some activity in like Walworth County, Waukesha, Jefferson County, kind of that Lake Geneva-ish area. You get into Sauk County out by Spring Green, west of Madison here, up into northeast Wisconsin. Then you go up to Bayfield, Ashland County, a lot of activity up there as well. This last summer, I remember driving through parts of Bayfield County and also the UP of Michigan in about late July. And in some areas, it was just very eerie. It had this feeling as if it were early spring and the canopy hadn't filled out yet. And it was defoliation from spongy moth in those cases. Now, one other thing I want to talk about, this isn't set on specific data. This is more of a general schematic to discuss what can happen with spongy moth population. So just to give you the lay of the land for this chart, the x-axis at the bottom, we have time. So over time, the black line, which is spongy moth population, that's going to fluctuate. Now, under a lot of years and a lot of conditions, if we have decent amount of rainfall and things like that, we have a whole bunch of things that eat spongy moth caterpillars, predators, parasites. We have diseases or pathogens that can infect the caterpillars and kill them and keep their populations low. If things shift, maybe we start getting some favorable weather patterns, spongy moth populations can start to increase. And if they have really good conditions, they can hit a tipping point where we hit an outbreak and their populations just shoot up. So that's what we have been seeing and experiencing here in the state the last couple of years. Now, eventually, that population is going to get so high that you're going to have overcrowding. You're going to have things like starvation and disease kick in. I mean, intuitively, it makes sense. We have learned with the COVID pandemic, if you pack a bunch of humans together, you're more likely to get spread of COVID. You pack a bunch of spongy moths together and have them crowded, diseases are more likely to spread amongst them as well. So when populations are high, at some point, they're going to crash back down What I can't tell you is exactly where we are on this chart. So the point I want to make is spongy moth populations will decline at some point. The million-dollar question is when. Now, if we have a rainy spring this year, that might bring that sooner. But if we had another dry spring this year, that might exacerbate the problem further. But eventually, they should come down. Now, why is spongy moth such a problem? First of all, it's really invasive. It can be moved around easily by humans. If we did nothing, if we removed humans from the equation, spongy moths wouldn't move all that far on their own. A reason for that, this will come up again later, but the females can't fly, the adult female moths. They can walk a little bit, but the males come to the females. So they're not really traveling all that far. But when you add humans back into the equation, humans unfortunately do a really good job at moving these around. You could have egg masses on underside of vehicles. That's what we see in the bottom left-hand picture. You could have egg masses on other items, potted plants, pallets of goods and commodities and things like that being moved around. Now, a typical egg mass of spongy moth might contain 500, maybe upwards of 1,000 eggs potentially. Let's say on average 750, 800 eggs, something like that. So anytime you're moving an egg mass, you're not just moving a caterpillar or a couple caterpillars, you're moving almost an entire population of caterpillars. And if you have a vehicle like the one on the left, if we count those beige egg masses, 1, 2, 3, 4, there might be 7 or 8 on there. So that could be several thousand caterpillars that are potentially being moved around. And so that really helps this insect move around on the map. Also, the caterpillar larvae are significant defoliators of a wide range of plants, mostly hardwood trees. They can feed on some conifers as well. We'll talk about that in a setting, but they can be pests both in forested areas, kind of more natural settings, but also in urban forests and landscape settings too. And then, as I just talked about on the last slide, under the right conditions, they can have very dynamic populations. You get 2, 3 consecutive dry years that favor their population, suppress diseases, and boom, we bump into an outbreak, which is what we're seeing at the moment. And as a result, we can have some significant defoliation from that. Now, in terms of host plants, this insect can feed on a very wide range of plants, a lot of trees, some shrubs as well. Most of these are going to be hardwoods. There are some conifers that can be attacked as well, but some of the very top favorite host plants would be things like oaks. If I had to pick probably top of my list, it'd be something like oaks in terms of where I hear of reports of them being an issue and feeding on plant foliage. Aspens, willows, lindens, basswood, birches as well, tamaracks, fruit trees, apple, crabapple, and things like that can be fed on. Some of the conifers, pines, and spruces can be fed on by older caterpillars. And I do want to point out, we've seen a pattern with some of the spruces like blue spruce, just because of the structure of the needles. I mean, you don't want to reach into a dense canopy on a blue spruce tree. It's just, you're going to get poked. Very, very dense. And that might be offering some protection of the caterpillars from predation by things like vertebrates and birds and stuff like that. Kind of, there's an obstacle course or jungle gym they can hide in. There are some plants that are acceptable. Maybe not their first choice, but if they're on it, they will feed on it. Maples, walnuts, hickories, cherry, some of the other prunus species, fruit trees and things like that. Hemlock, elm, hackberry, some of the other birches like black and yellow, box elder, cottonwood, and so on. And then there are also some plants they don't really like to feed on. Maybe if they were desperate, but otherwise they tend not to like these a whole lot. Some of the ash trees, so you don't have to worry about spongy moth for the most part on ash. We've got bigger things like emerald ash borer to worry about, arborvitae, red cedars, catalpa, sycamore, dogwood, and so on. But if they do pop up in a forested area where you've got a mixture of, say, oaks and birches and things like that, and maples, you can get very significant defoliation. That's what we see in the photo here on the right-hand portion of the slide. So let's talk about the actual insect. And again, you're going to be pretty familiar with these, at least some of the life stages. You probably recognize the bottom right-hand photo. When spongy moth caterpillars are larger, they've got some very distinctive bumps or nodules on their back that are paired blue and reddish nodules. But when they're younger, they have a slightly different appearance. So this is the damaging life stage. When you get damage to plants in your yard or in forested areas, from spongy moth, this is the life stage that is actually causing the damage. The caterpillars are voracious feeders. They've got chewing mouth parts, so they're using that to chew holes and notches on leaves. When they hatch out of the egg, they go through 5 to 6 instars or substages of larval development or larval growth. So they basically get a little bit bigger, they molt, they turn into a larger instar caterpillar, and they go through that a number of these instars or substages. So when they're really small, the first 2 instars, that's what we see in the photo in the upper right-hand corner. They're mostly blackish. They do have kind of a hairy, shaggy appearance with some yellowish spots on the body. I also want to point out that at this point in their life cycle, they are active in feeding both day and night. When they get a little bit older, they become wary of predation and they shift to nocturnal feeding. But when they're young, they will feed both day and night. Another thing that can happen is they can disperse by ballooning. So they hatch out of the eggs. The very tiny caterpillars release a strand of silk, and that can get blown in the wind and carry them fairly long distances. So in theory, you could look through your yard, scrape off every single egg mass, and think to yourself, I'm not going to have any this year. But maybe your neighbor with a big oak tree has some eggs that hatched in it, and those ballooning caterpillars can rain down from other areas nearby to you. So those are the small caterpillars. They do feed, although we'll talk about this in a sec. They don't cause all that much damage. Then once they get to be a little bit larger, 3rd instar, 4th, 5th, and 6th instars, they can get upwards of about 2 or so inches long when they are fully mature. They're going to be grayish with that very kind of hairy looking appearance. They've got those blue and reddish raised bumps on the head, or I'm sorry, on the body, and the head itself is kind of a black and whitish, kind of a web-like pattern on there. And these caterpillars are more wary of predation. So they switch to feeding primarily at night, and they will actually wander down from tree canopies and hide during the day. That'll come into play when we talk about some management efforts such as trapping. I also want to point out that the vast majority of the damage is caused by the final 2 instars. So what do I mean by that? This is a chart showing general leaf consumption by caterpillars, and this is actually for a different species of caterpillar, but the general trend holds true. So bigger, later instar caterpillars will consume much more leaf area than younger larvae. It's like if you had an infant baby, it's not going to consume as much as a teenager with a pizza in front of it. That teenager is just going to eat a lot more food. So the bigger ones eat more. And for spongy moth, about 80 to 90% of the actual defoliation is caused by the last 2 instars, the 5th and 6th instar. So what that can mean, though, is you could have young caterpillars present 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th instars for maybe several weeks, and that damage flies under the radar. And then all of a sudden, boom, they transform to that 5th instar and they start feeding like crazy. That can give the appearance of them appearing suddenly out of the blue, when really they've been lurking there for several weeks, maybe upwards of a month potentially. But once they hit that big later instar stage, they really start chowing down and causing a lot of damage in a relatively short period of time. The pupae, this is kind of the cocoon stage, if you will. These are these brownish pods, maybe an inch, maybe upwards of 1.5 inches long if you found a really big one. But they're these brownish pods. They look like a stubby cigar or something like that. They're brownish with these little tufts of golden kind of colored hairs or hair-like structures that come off of them. During this stage, they're kind of, inactive, if you will. They're not crawling around. They're just kind of sitting there. Internally, there's a lot of changes and restructuring going on with some of the tissues because they're transforming from that caterpillar stage into the adult stage. So they do go through complete metamorphosis. This stage is going to last for about 2 weeks or so, depending on temperature and things like that. And these pupae are usually present from about maybe late June, early July-ish into maybe early August. Depends a little bit on how warm a year we have, where you're located in the state, and so on. If you're farther north, that's going to shift things back a little bit in terms of the timing. And then we get the adult stages. So the adult moths are about 1.5 inches long or so. The males and females have different colorations. So you can visually tell them apart pretty easily. The females are whitish with some kind of mottled grayish stripes on the wings. Even though they have wings, they cannot fly. The adult females are flightless, meaning they can't move themselves all that far on their own. They can walk a little bit, but their strategy is the female releases a very, very potent sex pheromone, this perfume into the air, if you will, that's going to attract the males. The males are brownish. They've got these bushy antennae. That's the insect way of essentially smelling the pheromones. So those are for detecting the sex pheromones. One other interesting thing about the adult male moths is they are diurnal or day active. We know a lot of our moths tend to be active at night. So if it is, say, late July and you see a brownish moth flying around in your yard during the day, most likely that is going to be an adult spongy moth flying around. He is following that chemical perfume, trying to locate a female to mate with her. So males have to fly to females to mate. Overall, the adults are short-lived. They're not really feeding. They are linking up, they are mating, they are laying eggs, and then that's about it. They might live a week or two, but they're not terribly long-lived. Once the females lay egg masses, she is just kind of laying all her eggs in one batch. These big egg masses that can have 500 up to maybe 1,000 eggs to a really big one. And typical, it might be 700, 800, somewhere in that range. The egg masses, just to show you an actual one for size reference, they might be about 1 inch long, give or take, beige in color when they're very fresh, and they have kind of a dense, spongy texture to them. So those are the egg masses. In terms of the life cycle, 1 generation per year. This time of the year in winter, they are egg masses. Those egg masses are going to be present from late summer through the fall, all the way through the winter months, and they won't be hatching until about mid-spring. So that's a period of about 8 to 9 months. They just sit there as eggs. Mid to late spring and into maybe early summer, the caterpillars are active for about maybe 6-ish weeks, give or take, depends on temperature and things like that. Early summer, they pupate, so we get the pupal stage, and then the adults are out in kind of earlyish to midsummer, depending on your location. So that life cycle generally holds true for Madison area. If you were to go to far northern Wisconsin or up into the UP of Michigan, things are going to be shifted a little bit later, maybe a couple weeks later. Now switching gears to talk about management approaches for spongy moth, and there's a couple of different ways to think about this. If you think about management techniques as a toolbox, we have a lot of tools in the toolbox. We have to pick and choose what are the right tools for our given situation. Now, one way to think of it, on the very left-hand portion of the slide, we have some efforts that range from prevention all the way up to intervention, where we have a problem and we're trying to intervene, but maybe there's some preventative things we can do ahead of time to prevent spongy moth from becoming an issue next year. So we'll talk about some things like that. Another way to think about management is in light of IPM, or integrated pest management, meaning we've got all these tools in the toolbox. We don't want to rely on one single approach. My general philosophy on spongy moth is we should be trying a bunch of things. And in your individual yard and situation, you can pick and choose what works best for you. So we're going to talk about these different tiers of the pyramid, but kind of like a food pyramid, we want the good stuff at the bottom: cultural practices, physical and mechanical practices. I'll talk about what those mean in a second. We've got biological control options. A lot of that is kind of out of our hand, though. And then if need be, there are chemical control options, which we will discuss as well. Now, when it comes to management, as I said a moment ago, you really need to tailor these management approaches to your specific scenario and situation. So how large of an area are you talking about? Do you have a 50-acre or a 100-acre woodlot? That's a very different scenario than an urban or suburban yard with 2 oak trees in it. So night and day difference in terms of those scenarios. How large an area, the size of the area, how many trees are affected? How large are the trees? Maybe the tree that you saw spongy moth in was a crabapple tree in your front yard, and it's 15 feet tall or 12 feet tall, something like that. That's very different in terms of management options than a tree that's 60 feet tall in terms of being able to spray that tree, for example. How much free time do you have? There are some non-chemical approaches that can help, but you have to understand the limitations of those, and you really have to kind of stay on top of things and be doing some things in terms of management every single day. Sometimes folks have preferences for non-chemical or organic management only and things like that. Sometimes folks say, I don't care, I just want them dealt with and to protect my trees. And that's perfectly fine too for, especially high value trees. But the point I want to make is there's a lot of factors you have to consider. There's no single best option for managing spongy moth. There's a whole bunch of options that you have to pick and choose from. I also want to mention that for each of the management approaches, there are strengths and weaknesses and caveats and limitations. They are abundant, so you really need to be aware of these when you're looking at and understanding these tools in the toolbox. So cultural approaches, what are these? This is the manipulation of the local environment to help prevent pest problems or reduce the amount of damage. So this is kind of the planning and decision-making process. Things like regulatory control, that's on a much broader scale, but things like quarantines as an example, laws and things like that. That is not going to make that much of a difference in your individual yard. But when we look at the US map as a whole, those things might help in the grand scheme of things by slowing the overall spread, for example. And there's a nationwide program called the Slow the Spread program. So that's an example of things along those lines. Sanitation. We know that spongy moth, the larger caterpillars, like to hide during the day. Can we get rid of hiding spots in your yard? Can we get rid of spots where they might be tucking away egg masses and things like that? That is a consideration as well. For example, they can lay eggs in piles of firewood. Well, if you have your firewood maybe inside of some sort of box or storage cabinet thing, that may make it less accessible to spongy moths versus if it's just out in the open. In terms of plant health, maintaining proper plant health and general good plant care, that can include things like mulching, watering, just general tree care, pruning, and things like that. Minimizing stress. One thing that has come up just in the last couple of years when we have had some very dry, droughty conditions is making sure that those trees get an appropriate amount of watering. That can mean supplemental watering, even for large, well-established trees. If you do nothing and we're running into a drought, that can be stressful to those plants, and that can contribute to kind of a long-term decline potentially. And in some cases, we can tolerate the damage, but I'll argue that context is really important when it comes to that. One thing along these lines I want to point out, so there is a kind of a secondary insect, if you will, called the two-line chestnut borer. This is a pest historically of chestnut trees, which we don't really have around anymore, but these days oak trees. Now, in many situations, this insect is pretty well behaved. And what I mean by that is if your oak tree is happy and healthy, so to speak, two-line chestnut borer tends to leave it alone. It's waiting and watching for oak trees that are stressed and declining. That's when it gets its foot in the door and starts causing problems, and it'll cause some thinning or dieback of the canopy. So along those lines with respect to tolerance and tolerating the damage of spongy moth, let's say we had had a couple rainy springs in a row and our trees are generally in good health. A happy, healthy tree, so to speak, can tolerate even complete defoliation in most situations, and they may just leaf out fine the next year. They have enough energy reserves to do that, or depending on the time of season, they may put out another batch of leaves that growing season. Now, if this happens a couple years in a row, that tree's energy reserves are being depleted. It is being stressed over time. And so a couple of years ago, tolerating spongy moth defoliation might have been more of an option, but in some cases this year, because of consecutive years of drought, if you do have trees such as oaks that have really been stressed by drought and they haven't been getting supplemental water, then I start having concerns about insects like two-line chestnut borer and other secondary borers. On birch trees, for example, there's one called bronze birch borer, very similar to two-line chestnut borer. Then we've got some options for physical or mechanical control. So these are our physical activities that we're doing to help prevent or reduce pests through killing them or other activities. And I'll talk about each of these individually, but things like scraping away egg masses, can we crush various life stages, the caterpillars, the pupae, the adults, and so on? Can we use traps? In some cases, yes. And in other cases, they may not quite do what you think they might do. And we'll talk about that too. So physical removal of egg masses. Again, those egg masses contain up to 500, maybe potentially 1,000 eggs. And so every egg mass you remove, you are taking those out of the equation. So that's a very simple thing that can be done. Also keep in mind that the egg masses are present for a very long period of time. The majority of this insect life cycle is spent in the egg stage because their eggs are about 8 to 9 months, maybe from July until mid-May or so, depending on where you're located. That's a really long stretch of time that you can go out, look for the egg masses, and potentially remove them. You could use something like a putty knife to physically scrape them off. I do want to mention, though, If you're scraping these off, you don't want to simply scrape them off and let them fall onto the ground, because they may survive right there and hatch out fine, especially if they fell on the ground and they're now insulated under snow. So what you would want to do is scrape them off, maybe into a Ziploc bag them, seal them up, and discard of them that way. You could scrape them off into a container of soapy water, let them sit in soapy water for a couple days to suffocate before you get rid of them. Those would be some options, but don't just scrape them off and let them fall on the ground, because they can easily hatch in there. On the left-hand portion of the slide, I do show that picture I grabbed online of a metal putty knife. I might recommend, though, more of like a plastic putty knife, just because you don't want to injure tree bark. So be cognizant of that, and just be careful. We don't want to be gouging into trees and things like that. The egg masses can be on trees and plant materials, but I really want to point out they can be lots of other spots too. That could be the side of your home, side of a garage or other structures, soffit areas, things like that. They could be in piles of firewood, undersides of vehicles, campers, trailers, boats, and stuff like that. So don't just look at plants. They can be a lot of other hiding spots in your yard, just to show you how kind of good they can be at tucking these egg masses away. So the bottom center photo, you can see 2 egg masses there and 2 other ones that have been kind of partially scraped away. That's actually from my front yard in Middleton. I took that picture, it was back in about December, if I remember correctly. This was a crabapple tree in my front yard. It had some basal sprouts, some epicormic shoots at the bottom of that plant. And once it was cold enough, I was pruning those off, and hidden behind all those, there was not 1, but actually 5 spongy moth egg masses. This is one of them that I cut off just for demonstration purposes. So if I had not done that, there would have been 5 egg masses tucked away just on that one tree. And this was probably an area I'd estimate a single square foot or less. So they can really be tucked away sometimes. So you really want to be thorough when you're looking for egg masses. One other thing I want to mention is that you might be seeing old egg masses around. The older ones from a year, 2, 3 years ago, they're going to tend to be kind of faded, more whitish beige. And you can see in this photo on the right-hand portion of the slide, that older one on the right, it's missing some chunks and stuff like that. You can really tell that it's an older one compared to the more brownish one to the left of it. That is a fresher egg mass. So if you're seeing old egg masses, you really don't have to worry about those, because they wouldn't have viable eggs. The fresh ones is what you want to focus on. Now, also in terms of caveats and limitations, if you're going around your yard looking for these, that can be somewhat time consuming. I would say if you've got kids or grandkids, and you can pay them a nickel or a quarter per egg mass, you could maybe get them to have a fun scavenger hunt, but you could spend quite a bit of time looking for these if you have a large yard or a lot of trees, or you just have had historically a high population of spongy moth in your area. Another caveat is that there are some of these that may just be hard to find or out of reach. And with that said, I do want you to be safe while you are doing this. This is actually, I'll show you in a second, a picture from historical egg mass removal efforts. I'll show that in a second. One other thing I want to mention about egg masses is you don't necessarily have to remove them right away when they are laid in July or say early August. The reason I say that is there is a little parasitic wasp that can attack the eggs. And if you give them a chance to build up the population of those wasps, that may give them more of an army to attack nearby egg masses too. So just be aware of that. But this time of year, by all means, go out, scrape those egg masses. Maybe not today, it's pretty darn cold out there, but when it warms up in a couple of days, feel free to do that. As I said, keep safety in mind. I have known folks that have been seriously injured falling off ladders. So I don't want you to do anything like this. This is actually a historical picture from over 100 years ago of some early egg mass control efforts. All those folks up in that tree, that just kind of makes me cringe thinking about it. So by all means, please be safe. And if you see egg masses that are just too high up in your tree, don't try going up there to get those. I don't want you falling down. Now, some other options: crushing spongy moths, crushing the caterpillars, pupae, or adults. So we can crush them and squish them to kill them, but there are caveats. So the caterpillars or larvae, you do notice they have kind of this hairy appearance. Technically, those aren't hairs like our hairs. We call them seedy to an entomologist, but We also refer to them as urticating hairs or irritating hairs. It turns out on the spongy moth, they have a couple different types of these seedier hairs. Some of them actually link up to glands that produce histamine. And so if you were to grab these or touch them, they can irritate your skin, kind of similar to if you were to grab a handful of like fiberglass insulation. It can cause irritation, tingling, prickling. The histamine can get in there and cause some kind of dermatitis type reaction too. So if you're squishing caterpillars, I would recommend taking a tool handle, a stick, or something else like that. Maybe wear some thick leather gloves and squish them that way rather than using bare hands. Pupae, go for it, squish those. You could use a stick or tool handle as well, just because they may be kind of ooey gooey. When it comes to squishing the adults, you can squish the adults, but I want to point out the females possess that very, very potent sex pheromone, which can be pretty long lasting. And so if you squish a female with your bare hand, that can be absorbed in your skin. And then guess what? You may be attractive to male spongy moths for quite a while. I had chatted with a colleague at the DNR who mentioned a story along the lines of squishing females with a particular tool handle. And every year, the adult male moths were attracted to that tool handle. So it can be a very long-lasting pheromone. If you want to do some squishing with your hands, maybe throw on a disposable glove, nitrile, latex, vinyl, something like that. Because again, you don't want to get that on bare skin, or you don't want to get it on that same pair of gardening gloves that you use again and again, because at a certain time of the year, you may make yourself pretty attractive to the males. Now, trapping efforts. We do have some options here for both larger and smaller caterpillars. So for small caterpillars, we can use what we call sticky bands. You got to wrap the tree with duct tape or plastic wrap or something like that. And then we're putting a sticky substance on there. That could be something like Vaseline, although if it's really hot, that could be runny. There's a substance you can buy called Tanglefoot, which is just really horribly sticky stuff, but it works in terms of insects sticking to it. So we put this sticky material on the tape. That's what we see in the left-hand picture. Then as those small caterpillars are trying to climb up or down the tree, remember they can balloon and get blown into nearby areas. They've got to walk up a tree to feed. They'll contact the sticky surface and get caught. Now, this will work against small caterpillars, but when the caterpillars get big enough, they might be able to get over that. Or if some of their comrades get trapped there, they'll just walk over those. So you have to understand the caveats and limitations of that. You also just don't want to leave this up all year round on your trees. And as I said, you need to put duct tape or a cling wrap or something like that on the tree. You don't want to put Vaseline or Tanglefoot directly on the bark of the tree. That can block some oxygen flow into the tree as well. And then also, if you have concerns about vertebrates, birds, squirrels, things like that, you could consider kind of tacking some chicken wire or something over that sticky barrier to deter vertebrates from getting to that. So this can help, but it's really a good option against the small caterpillars. Once they get bigger, it's not going to work very well. When you have larger caterpillars, remember the larger caterpillars are nocturnal feeders, so they feed at night, and during the day they wander down, they will hide on the ground or other tucked away spots. So we can actually give them a hiding spot using a burlap band. You can see in the photo on the left, all you do is you tie string or twine around the tree trunk, you put a strip of burlap and you fold that over. So you basically have a burlap taco hanging down, and then the caterpillars can hide underneath that. Now, if all we do is hang up the burlap and we do nothing else, we are giving them simply a hiding spot. We need to go out there essentially on a daily basis, lift up that burlap and scrape them into a bucket of soapy water. That's what my colleague from the DNR is doing in those photos. So you have to understand how these management efforts work, the caveats and limitations. Again, if you just put up the burlap band and do nothing else, you're simply giving them a hiding spot. You need to daily, ideally, go out there, lift the burlap up, knock them into a container of soapy water to take them out of the equation. But both those trapping methods can be good and helpful for individual trees in your yard. Very easy to do, too. I do want to mention pheromone traps. Sometimes folks will ask about these. Hey, can I buy these and use them in my yard? They're really not going to help you in your individual situation in your yard. These are used more for large-scale monitoring, looking at year-to-year trends and things like that. So it can help with state-level efforts, the overall slow the spread program and things like that. But again, this isn't something that you put in your yard to control the situation of spongy moth in individual yard type settings. So that is more for government monitoring type use rather than use in controlling populations in your yard. So you really have to understand what those are used for and what they do. Biological control, this is relying on Mother Nature, predators and parasites and things like that. There are predatory insects like ground beetles, predatory stink bugs. Mice really like to feed on spongy moth pupae. There are some birds that will feed on the caterpillars and pupae and things like that. There are some parasites. I'll click the button. You'll see this little video clip on the right-hand portion of the slide. That's an egg mass that has some of these little parasitic wasps. They look like little gnats. They're about 2 millimeters long. But that particular species, they will lay eggs. Inside the eggs of spongy moth. The wasp larva consumes spongy moth, kills it, and they can help control the outer layer, at least, of spongy moth eggs. They might take out perhaps upwards of 25, 30%. They're not going to take out all the spongy moths in a given egg mass, but they'll help. And I mentioned earlier with regard to scraping egg masses, if you're seeing these around, it's okay to wait, especially in August and September. Let these wasps do their thing, build up their numbers so they can attack other nearby egg masses too before you scrape them off. There's also some pathogens or diseases. There's a fungus, there's a virus as well. Now, I mentioned moisture and rainfall earlier. Do we have an ace in the hole potentially? We could. There is a fungal disease, an introduced fungus called Entomophaga maimaga. This is from native parts of the range of different types of spongy moth. And there's a long history with it. Well over 100 years ago, it was introduced. There was an effort in the mid-'80s. Those didn't seem to really work. They were kind of deemed unsuccessful, possibly due to weather conditions at the time. But then all of a sudden, 1989, infected caterpillars were found out in nature. This was in the parts of the eastern US, but it has since been moved around through various efforts, and we do have it here in Wisconsin. If the conditions are right, that is, we have enough dampness and moisture from rain and other things, this fungus can kill spongy moth caterpillars in a matter of days, about 5-ish days or so. The spores can reproduce themselves and be spread around. So if we have a rainy spring, that can really help us out. But weather, and especially moisture, plays a critical role. So again, hope for a rainy spring this year. Just to elaborate that in a little bit more detail, we see in this diagram, the spores actually can overwinter places like the soil and things like that. They germinate in spring. Hopefully you got lots of moisture. They will infect caterpillars. The caterpillars die. You get more spore release, and you can go through a couple of cycles of these. So if we have rainy conditions, that can really help us out. If we have dry weather, it's going to suppress activity of that fungus. Now, to go along with these, that notion, this is a precipitation chart from last year. And just due to sake of time, I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, but last year we didn't get a whole lot of rain in May and June. So that key period of time when spongy moth is very active, we weren't getting a whole lot of rain. That black line is accumulated precipitation. It's relatively flat at that point. Whereas once we get into mid-July to mid-August, we see a couple rain showers there of 1.5 inches to 2 inches. So we got more rain later on. But overall, it was a dry, drouthy year last year. And again, that would have suppressed that beneficial fungus, Entomophaga maimaga. Now, chemical control. So this is the use of chemical pesticides. There's a lot of options out there. There are some that are kind of lower risk. You might call those biorational or see that term used sometimes. There's conventional pesticides as well. They can target different life stages. Mostly we're going after the caterpillars. There's some options for the eggs, but you have to understand how these work, the limitations, the caveats, and things like that. Each pesticide differs in terms of the insect it works against, how long they last. Are they going to harm other insects, beneficials, for example? And also a quick disclaimer, you always have to read and follow the pesticide label. Those are legally binding instructions. And also for any products I'm showing, that's just to give you some examples. That's not any sort of formal endorsement. Now, some lower risk pesticides for caterpillars, these are foliar and contact-based. So these are options when you have perhaps shorter trees that are 10, 15 feet tall or less, or shrubs or things like that. This is going to be harder to use on trees that are 30, 40, 50 feet tall. Now, these lower risk products are often from natural sources. maybe plant-based or from a naturally occurring microbe, bacteria, something like that. In many cases, they'll have organic labeling, not always, but in general, they tend to be a little bit less toxic than synthetic products, but they tend not to last as long. So you have to understand some of the caveats and limitations of these. Some common options that you and I can find at most hardware stores, things like insecticidal soap, horticultural oils like neem oil and mineral oil and things like that, also pyrethrins. These can work, and they can work pretty well to kill caterpillars, but primarily by contact, meaning you have to spray it right onto the caterpillars. The things about insecticidal soaps and oils, once they dry, they stop working. So if it is 90 degrees, breezy and hot, and you spray those, they might be dry within 5 to 10 minutes. Then they are done working. So you really need to understand the limitations of those. There are some products like azadirachtin. That's not the same thing as neem oil, if you're familiar with that. Azadirachtin is an active ingredient. Spinosad, which is a bacterial-based product. And then one I want to highlight, BTK, Bacillus thuringiensis kerstachii. This is what is generally used for aerial spraying efforts. Works well against small caterpillars. If you've got big caterpillars that are an inch, inch and a half, 2 inches long, it is really going to struggle to kill those, but it can work well against small caterpillars. You got to time it correctly. There are some conventional products for foliar sprays. These are synthesized in the lab, but a lot of cases, they may be based chemically upon naturally occurring compounds. These tend to be more potent and typically longer lasting than some of those products I just mentioned on the last slide. They also tend to be pretty broad spectrum, meaning, yes, they can kill spongy moth, but they can also potentially affect a wide range of insects. Some of the commonest ones are pyrethroids. These tend to end in the letters THRIN. When you go to the garden center or hardware store, most insecticides you will find contain those ingredients, but you have to read the label and see, does it say you can apply it to landscape trees and shrubs and other plants and things like that. Just some examples. Again, these tend to end in the letters THRIN. So ingredients such as bifenthrin, cyfluthrin, cypermethrin, deltamethrin, permethrin, and so on. Tree care professionals, i.e. arborists, do have some other options as well. Those are things that you and I just would have a hard time finding, have to be ordered through special vendors and things like that. And also with these foliar sprays, these can be sprayed onto foliage. It'll act as a protecting barrier or coating on those leaves for maybe upwards of about 2 weeks or so. It depends product to product. But you have to consider tree size. If you've got a tree that's 80 feet tall, it's just going to be impossible to really spray up into that canopy. If you've got a tree that's 30, 40 feet tall, tree care professionals do have some options sometimes for that. But, you know, there's going to be perhaps a little bit of drift and things like that. It's hard to contain that spray right there, but it is an option in some cases. But again, you have to understand those caveats and limitations. There are also some systemic treatments. There's some options for homeowners. Professional arborists have some additional options. These move within the plant, so they might be applied to the soil as a drench or a soil injection or a trunk injection, where arborists will actually drill holes into the trunk of the tree and inject kind of squirt stuff under the bark so it moves upwards. That's nice in that we're not spraying a cloud at the canopy. But this can be a fairly slow process for many of these ingredients. And it can take sometimes a matter of several weeks for this to really kick in and work. Large trees, just due to the size of them, the diameter of the trunk, the amount of product that you need, homeowners don't have really good options for those. Arborists have some additional options that aren't available to homeowners. You also have to consider the length of time for uptake. I talked about with the instars. The big 5th and 6th instars cause most of the damage, but if you don't kind of catch them early and all of a sudden you're caught off guard and you've got nearly mature caterpillars, if you do a systemic treatment that takes 3 weeks to get up into the tree, those insects might be done feeding by then, and so it doesn't really help you out in that situation. So really got to plan ahead with some of this stuff. Consider caterpillar size too. If they're relatively small, that could help us out. If they're big and ready to pupate, you know, we've kind of missed the boat in that situation. And then treatments of egg masses. So there are some horticultural oils that can treat egg masses. You would do this when temperatures are just consistently above freezing, ideally about 40 or so degrees. And remember, the eggs are present for a long period of time. A caveat, though, is it's really hard to find products that'll work well against the egg masses. You can find some general horticultural oils at hardware stores and things like that. But if you read the instructions, they legally only allow you to do about a 1 to 2% dilution. And we know that doesn't work all that well against spongy moth egg masses. May kill some, but it's not going to take them all out. There's one particular product, Golden Pest Spray Oil, which is a soybean oil-based product. It's about 93% soybean oil with some surfactants in there as well. We know from a couple of studies it can work very, very well against spongy moth egg masses. A caveat, though, is it's expensive and it's really hard to find that product. You have to do some sleuthing online to find a source of that. And with that said, some parting words of wisdom. Again, consider your individual situation, how many trees you have, how big, and things like that. Plan ahead. If you want to be working with an arborist, for example, don't call them in beginning of June when you've got large caterpillars. They're probably booked already, so do be planning ahead. Search for egg masses on your property. You've got lots of time. You've got about 5 months or so before those are going to be hatching. You can physically remove those egg masses or treat them when appropriate. But also, if you want to treat with that Golden Pest Spray Oil, look for that now rather than 3 months from now. It might be even harder to find. Also, be familiar with that spongy moth life cycle. Know when to be looking for caterpillars from about mid-May onwards. Going to depend a little bit on how warm it is, how early of a spring we have. And don't get caught off guard by late instar caterpillars. Maybe they've been lurking there for several months and boom, all of a sudden they're eating a lot. Well, you really kind of miss the boat on that one sometimes. And then also, as I said, if you're going to consider working with an arborist, maybe you've got some big high-value oak trees that have been clobbered the last couple years, chat with them now if you haven't already started that conversation. Don't wait until May to start the conversation because you might be having to call around to find someone that can actually treat your trees. And then hope for a rainy spring because, again, that fungal disease, Entomophaga myimaga, if we have enough moisture and precipitation, that could really help us out. And then if you're looking for additional information, we do have our extension Spongy Moth website. We've got fact sheets, all sorts of other information like a month-by-month management guide. And then just to wrap things up, if you want today's handouts, again, if you head to my website in that bottom left-hand box, I have them available. And Lisa, I will hand it back over to you. I know we ran over by about 2 minutes, but I'd be happy to address any of the questions that we had pop up.
Thanks, PJ. That was awesome. Yes, we have technically run out of time. If you do have to leave, that's fine. If you want to stay for a few minutes, we can have PJ answer some questions. The only one that I really saw in the box was a question about are there any other different caterpillars that are bad for oaks, and what is the current biggest issue for oaks right now?
Yeah, good question. I mean, so oaks are interesting. There is a study that came out within the last couple of years that looked at like overall species use. This is like invertebrates, insects, and other things that rely on plants to complete their life cycle. And it turns out if you want to do something really good for biodiversity, you would plant oak trees. That was like the #1 tree because it can support so many different species of caterpillars and other things. So there's hundreds of things that technically can feed or live on oaks. The vast majority of them will cause just a trivial amount of damage. There's a few other caterpillars I occasionally see pop up on oaks that might cause some defoliation. Usually it's a little bit of nibbling here and there. Very rarely would I see just complete defoliation the way that I would with spongy moth, though. So a lot of the other caterpillars I see on oaks as being pests, they tend to be relatively minor species. I know this last year, some colleagues with the DNR did see some species in far northern Wisconsin that were causing some defoliation. These were from the family Tortricity, some of the leaf rollers and relatives like that. But otherwise, spongy moth is probably #1 on my list in terms of a defoliation threat that I see. I also did mention that 2-line chestnut borer. And again, just to reiterate, if you have an oak tree that has been stressed for a couple years now because of drought stress, and also it's getting defoliated by spongy moth. That tree can be kind of running ragged, and that when it opens it up to attack by two-line chestnut borer. Two-line chestnut borer is a native relative of emerald ash borer, and it's going to cause some death of the tips of the branches first. And if that tree continues to be stressed, it may kind of work its way down the canopy over a couple of years potentially. So that can be a slippery slope if the tree is stressed enough that those secondary borers start getting in. I've seen a lot of two-line chestnut borer at my lab the last year or two.
Okay, we did just get a number of questions in here. I'm gonna ask one that I selfishly admit that I'm interested too. If it says, if the males are so attracted to female hormone, why are there no hormone traps? Wouldn't killing the males help reduce laying of eggs?
Yeah, so I mean, I did mention that there are the pheromone traps, but the pheromone traps are not a black hole that just sucks in all the males. We see the same kind of thing with like Japanese beetles. Yes, you can buy traps for them, but we know there's a well-documented spillover effect with the Japanese beetle traps where you'll actually get more that fly into the general area and land there and feed on plants. So that's why we don't see spongy moth traps available for use in homeowner situations. They just don't seem to work in terms of reducing the population in an individual yard. They can be very useful on the monitoring side of things, looking at the bigger picture. I didn't mention it, but there are some other efforts that do use the pheromones in a slightly different route or methodology. They'll use this sometimes in like orchard settings or other situations where they use a synthetic version of this pheromone, either as flakes or sometimes it's formulated in like a caulk gun. And the idea is they'll go into an area and put out just a whole bunch of this perfume, if you will, to try and confuse the insects and make it harder to find. But that stuff is going to be pretty expensive. And also, you have to think about your own yard in, say, an urban or suburban setting. If you did something that might take out some of them in your yard, but you've got plenty of egg masses around you, some can still balloon in. So again, the pheromones just aren't really a good option for individual yards. They work better over larger areas.
Okay, I think we can get one more question in here. I'll combine them. Can egg masses on the tree be anywhere on the trunk? And do large caterpillars drop to the ground and climb up to the canopy every day and night?
Yeah, so in terms of the egg masses, they can be a lot of different locations. Have been some studies that looked at like the orientation on a tree and difference in survival. If you think about a tree on a day like today, it's a blustery cold day, but we had some pretty bright sun earlier today. And so you can have temperature differences on, say, the south and western side of a tree compared to the north and eastern side. So there's some differences there, but you can find them on all sides of the trunks. Where I live in Middleton, we got a lot of big oaks near me. And so I'll look up and you'll just see these large branches. Undersides are coated with egg masses as well. So just about anywhere on the branches of those trees as well. Again, I want to highlight, they can be on other non-plant material in your yard. Firewood piles, patio furniture, boards stacked against the shed, undersides of trailers, tractors, lawnmowers, stuff that's left outside, kids' toys, things like that. So they can really be tucked away in a lot of different locations. And then to follow up on that comment on burlap bands in the list, yeah, with those burlap bands, if you're doing that to try and trap the caterpillars, don't just lift up the first flap, look under that as well, right against the trunk too, because they can often hide there. And then in terms of the behavior of the large caterpillars, yeah, they can march down on a daily basis, go hide during the daytime, and then they'll wander back up later in the day to feed during the nighttime hours.
All righty. Well, we're 10 minutes over here. So I would encourage you folks, if you have any further questions, you can contact PJ at the Insect Diagnostic Lab. And I want to thank you, PJ, for taking some time out of your busy day to help us better understand spongy moth and management techniques.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Okay, and we will be emailing this presentation or giving you a link to the presentation, everybody who was registered for this program today. And it will also be available, a link to it at the Tree Canopy Collaborative website. So thanks everybody for attending.